Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. My hometown of Los Alamos, New Mexico is the most educated city in the world, with more than 1/4 of the residents sporting PhDs. Los Alamos National Laboratory has a brand new paper out. Arctic temperatures are increasing 4 times faster than global warming. Peter Chilek is the lead author of this study. He says, since 1970, the Arctic has experienced a larger warming trend than most of the globe, leading to decreasing Arctic sea ice cover, melting of the Greenland ice sheet, and rising sea levels. So I wonder why Peter chose to start a study in the year 1970. According to this 1974 graph from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, Earth cooled tremendously from the 1940s until 1970, and 1970 was in fact cooler than 1870. Also in 1970, the New York Times reported U.S. and Soviet press studies of a colder Arctic. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. These scientists were so worried about global cooling, they wanted to sprinkle coal dust on the Arctic ice pack in order to melt it. So it's pretty clear why Peter Chilek chose to start a study in 1970, because it was very cold in 1970. By starting the study at a very cold time, it was easy to show warming and melting of ice. This graph from NASA shows the measured thermometer data at the capital of Iceland since the year 1900. Temperatures in Iceland warmed very rapidly from 1920 to 1940, then cooled into the 1970s, and after that they warmed up again. The eastern Arctic was very warm around 1940, and it was reported that all the glaciers in eastern Greenland were rapidly melting. In 1939, the leading Arctic expert of his time, Professor Hans Alman, reported, "It may without exaggeration be said that the glaciers of Greenland, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse." In this paper, he reported the tremendous warming which had occurred in the eastern Arctic and the rapid retreat of glaciers in Norway. In 1952, the leading American Arctic expert, Dr. William Carlson, said, "The glaciers of Norway and Alaska are only half the size they were 50 years ago." Now let's take a look at what actually controls these swings in temperature in the eastern Arctic. The Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation is an ocean circulation pattern which shows the same patterns. And if we overlay the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation on Reykjavik temperatures, we can see that they line up very closely. The blue line is Reykjavik temperatures, and the red line is the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. They're almost identical. Temperatures in the eastern Arctic are controlled by ocean circulation patterns, not carbon dioxide. Now let's talk about Greenland. The surface of Greenland receives a lot more snow every year than melts. This P-38 crashed on the Greenland ice sheet in July 1942. 50 years later, it was dug up from underneath 82 meters of ice. Most of Greenland's surface gains more than 1.5 meters of ice every year. For 4 of the last 6 years, including this year, the gain has been well above average. And during this summer, the surface mass balance has been above average every single day. No matter how many times the press, politicians, and academics lie about it, Greenland is not melting down. The North Pole is having its coldest summer on record, with temperatures below the 1958 to 2002 average every single day for the past 2 months. Arctic sea ice extent is higher now than it was 15 years ago, when Nobel laureate Al Gore predicted the Arctic would be ice-free by the year 2014. But around the time Stonehenge was built, when carbon dioxide levels were much lower in the atmosphere, the Arctic was likely ice-free. Mean July temperatures along the northern coast of Russia may have been 2.5 to 7 degrees Celsius warmer than they are now. And trees grew all the way to the edge of the Arctic Ocean in Canada. The current tree line is 100 kilometers further south. But you don't have to take my word for it. Let's take a look at this 2009 paper from none other than Peter Chilek. He's the same person who wrote the current Los Alamos paper which I'm discussing in this video. Arctic air temperature change amplification and the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. July 16, 2009. Understanding Arctic temperature variability is essential for assessing possible future melting of the Greenland ice sheet. Arctic sea ice and Arctic permafrost. Temperature trend reversals in 1940 and 1970 separate two Arctic warming periods. 1910 to 1940 and 1970 to 2008. They are separated by a significant 1940 to 1970 cooling period. Analyzing temperature records of the Arctic meteorological stations, we find that the Arctic amplification is not constant but varies in time on a multi-decadal timescale. Then he goes on to say that Arctic temperatures are highly correlated with the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. So in 2009, Peter Chalik was saying almost exactly the same things which I'm saying in this video. But in his new paper, he left out all the data prior to the very cold year of 1970, because it's no longer possible in the year 2022 for researchers to get funding if they tell the truth about climate. Fortunately, I don't need academic funding, so unlike Peter Chalik, I'm free to tell the truth. This graph shows the complete time series for the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation going back to 1860. This peak was 1939, when the glaciers of Greenland and Norway were facing the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. But the largest peak occurred in the year 1878. 1878 was the conjunction of a number of climate events. There was a very large El Nino. It was a record high year for the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, and the Indian Ocean dipole was also very active. This led to a terrible heat wave and drought which killed tens of millions of people around the world. In India, about 10 million people died from the famine resulting from that heat wave and drought, and in China about 20 million people died. Brazil also lost about 2 million. Minnesota didn't have any winter weather during the winter of 1877 to 1878. And in Australia, the month of January 1878 will be long remembered by the farming community as a period of heat and drought scarcely ever known or experienced in this colony before. In the year 2000, NASA showed 1878 as being the warmest year prior to 1980. And NASA showed no net warming from 1870 to 1980. But this didn't suit the needs of politicians, so shortly thereafter, NASA erased the heat of 1878. They also massively cooled the past to create the appearance of a warming trend which doesn't actually exist. And what about the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation peak in 1939? Let's see what they did to that. They used to show 1939 as being the warmest year in Reykjavik, Iceland, but then they altered the data to completely erase that warm period. NASA has tampered with the Reykjavik data up and down many times, so it's difficult to say what they're doing with it right now. Peter Chalik used to be a very good scientist with a good reputation, but it appears that the administration at Los Alamos Laboratories has gotten to him. 40 years ago, Toto's dad was working at Los Alamos Labs, and he's really glad he doesn't have to do that anymore. You can visit Toto, Kyrie, Caesar, Toki, and Upala on the web at realclimatescience.com.